Dust tasted like copper and failure. He was 90 pounds of pure anxiety, a German shepherd tearing his own throat on a choke collar while grown men screamed useless commands. They called him a washout. Casey called it a tragic misread. Sometimes the loudest command is the one you never give. Gravel crunched under heavy combat boots, the sound immediately swallowed by the oppressive, suffocating heat of the Nevada training yard. It was 104 degrees in the shade, but there was no shade out here on the blacktop. Just sun-baked asphalt, chain-link fences that burned to the touch, and the sharp, acidic stench of nervous dog sweat mixing with human frustration. Casey leaned against the perimeter fence, ignoring the way the metal seared through her cotton t-shirt. Her right knee throbbed, a deep, rhythmic ache left over from a blown door in Kandahar 3 months ago. She was supposed to be on light duty, riding a desk, pushing paperwork until the Navy decided if her joint was stable enough to kick down doors again. Instead, she had spent the last 3 days out here at the K-9 facility, watching handlers try to force square pegs into round holes. In the center of the yard, the square peg was currently having a meltdown. His name was Bruno. He was a 2-year-old German shepherd bred for violence and obedience, imported from a pristine bloodline in Belgium. Right now, he looked like a junkyard stray terrified of his own shadow. "Hold the line. Yank him back. Dominate the space, Jenkins." The lead instructor, a broad-shouldered guy named O'Connor, whose face was currently the color of raw steak, was barking orders from the sideline. Jenkins, a young handler who looked like he hadn't slept since basic training, gave the heavy leather leash a vicious tug. "Heel! Bruno! Heel!" Bruno didn't heel. The dog spun in a chaotic, frantic circle, his claws scrambling and slipping on the hot asphalt. His ears were pinned flat against his skull. Thick ropes of saliva slung from his jowls, splattering onto Jenkins' boots. The dog's eyes were wide, showing the whites, what trainers called whale eye. It was the universal K-9 signal for a complete psychological overload. Jenkins yanked the prong collar again. The metal links pinched tight around Bruno's neck. The dog choked, a wet hacking sound, but the pain didn't snap him out of it. It only escalated his panic. He lunged forward, not at the decoy in the bite suit standing 20 yards away, but at empty air. He snapped his jaws at a ghost, desperately trying to bite his way out of the sensory nightmare. "He's washed!" O'Connor spat, wiping sweat from his forehead with the back of a thick, calloused hand. "He's got no nerve. The moment you introduce stress, he fractures. We're wasting our time." Casey took a slow drag from the lukewarm water bottle in her hand. The plastic cracked loudly in the silence that followed O'Connor's assessment. She didn't particularly care for dogs. She wasn't a handler. She was a shooter. But she knew what a broken circuit looked like. She knew what it felt like to be pushed so hard by external noise that your internal wiring just melted down. She watched Bruno. The dog was panting so fast his ribcage looked like it might shatter. His tongue lolled out, swollen and purple. He was looking at Jenkins, but he wasn't seeing him. He was looking through him, searching for an exit that didn't exist. Jenkins was trying to establish alpha dominance, standing tall, puffing his chest, keeping the leash taut, locking the dog into a battle of physical tension. It was stupid. It was mathematically stupid. Jenkins weighed 180 pounds. The dog weighed 90. Jenkins could drag him, choke him, or pin him, but he couldn't force the dog's brain to process the threat. "Send the decoy," Jenkins pleaded, his voice cracking slightly. "Let me try to trigger his prey drive. If he just bites the sleeve, he'll reset." O'Connor sighed, a sound heavy with disgust. He nodded at the decoy, a guy wrapped in 40 pounds of padded canvas. The decoy yelled, waving a bamboo stick, and charged. He stamped his feet, making loud, aggressive noises. Bruno didn't step up to meet the threat. He scrambled backward. The dog hit the end of the leash with a heavy thud, choking himself again. He cowered, dropping his belly to the boiling asphalt, a low, pathetic whine vibrating in his throat. It was humiliating. It was the exact opposite of what a Tier 1 tactical dog was supposed to do. A SEAL dog was supposed to take a bullet, clear a room, tear the throat out of an insurgent. This dog was trying to dig a hole in solid concrete to hide. "That's it. Cut it. Drill's over," O'Connor barked. "Tag him out. We'll put him on the transfer list for a local police department. Maybe he can sniff bags at an airport. He's not built for the teams." Jenkins slumped, defeat radiating from his shoulders. He stopped pulling on the leash. For a second, the line went slack. Bruno stayed on the ground, shivering despite the blistering heat, waiting for the next yank. Casey watched the dog's ribs heave. She hated this part of the military. The clinical, disposable nature of it all. If a tool didn't work the way the manual said it should, you threw it in the scrap pile. Nobody stopped to ask if they were holding the tool upside down. She pushed off the fence. Her knee gave a sharp twinge of protest, a spike of hot pain that made her grit her teeth. But she ignored it, limping slightly as she walked out onto the blacktop. "Hey," Casey said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the heavy, stagnant air. Jenkins turned, looking at her with a mixture of annoyance and embarrassment. O'Connor frowned, crossing his massive arms over his chest. "Can I help you, Chief?" O'Connor asked, his tone dripping with the polite condescension reserved for operators who weren't in their own lane. Casey didn't look at O'Connor. She kept her eyes on the dog. Bruno was watching her now, his head still pressed to the ground. "You're suffocating him," Casey said, her voice flat, devoid of emotion. Jenkins flushed red. "I'm maintaining control, Chief. If I give him an inch right now, he bolts. He bolts because you're standing over him like a predator holding a garrote," Casey replied, stopping about 10 feet away. She could smell the fear on the dog. It was distinct, sour, sharp, metallic. "You're feeding all your anxiety straight down that leather strap into his neck. He doesn't know who the enemy is. The guy in the suit or the guy holding the leash. Look, Chief, with all due respect, you're a pipe hitter, not a K9 expert," O'Connor intervened, stepping forward to close the distance. "This animal failed the stress test. It's a genetic flaw. You can't fix weak nerves." "Nerves aren't weak," Casey muttered, eyes locked on the shepherd. "They're just misdirected. Hand me the leash." Jenkins looked at O'Connor. O'Connor gave a slow, cynical shrug, a gesture that clearly said, "Let her make a fool of herself." Jenkins unclipped his carabiner from his belt, holding the looped end of the leather leash out to Casey. She closed the distance slowly. She didn't make eye contact with Bruno. She kept her posture loose, casual, rolling her shoulders to bleed off her own tension. When she took the leash from Jenkins, the leather was slick with the young handler's sweat. "Back up," Casey told Jenkins. "He might bite if you—" Jenkins started. "Back up," she repeated, harder this time. Jenkins backed away, joining O'Connor on the sideline. The decoy stood awkwardly in the middle of the yard, unsure if he should stay in character or drop the bamboo stick. "You too, Michelin man," Casey called out to the decoy. "Go stand by the fence. Be a tree." The yard fell completely silent, save for the hum of a distant generator and the ragged, wet sound of Bruno's breathing. Casey stood at the end of the 6-foot leash. She didn't pull it tight. She let it drape, a heavy arc of leather drooping to touch the blacktop. She didn't look at the dog. She looked past him, at the hazy heat waves rising off the corrugated metal roof of the kennels. Bruno stayed flat on the ground. He was confused. The tension on his neck was gone, but the heavy, suffocating pressure of human expectation was still hanging in the air. He let out another soft whine, shifting his weight, preparing to scramble if she made a sudden move. Casey did nothing. Seconds ticked by. The sun beat down on the back of her neck, raising goosebumps despite the heat. She felt the ache in her knee, the gritty sand between her teeth, from a morning dust devil. She grounded herself in her own physical discomfort, slowing her breathing. In through the nose, out through the mouth, slow, rhythmic. Dogs don't just read body language, they read respiration. They smell the cortisol spikes in human sweat. They hear heartbeats. Right now, Casey was deliberately lowering her own heart rate, making herself the most boring, unthreatening thing in a 10-mile radius. A full minute passed. O'Connor shifted impatiently on his feet, opening his mouth to say something, but Casey shot him a withering, dead-eyed glare that snapped his jaw shut. Finally, Bruno stopped panting quite so hard. He closed his mouth. The heavy ropes of drool dripped onto the pavement. He lifted his head an inch. Casey still didn't look at him. She just waited. It was an agonizing test of patience. In combat, you force the breach. You kick the door. You throw the flashbang. You dictate the violence of action. But handling trauma, whether it was a broken teammate or a shattered dog, required the exact opposite. It required yielding the space. Bruno slowly pushed himself up into a sitting position. He looked at Casey. He looked at the slack leash. He looked back at Casey. Then Casey did something entirely unscripted. She didn't yell, "Heel." She didn't command sit. She put 2 fingers in her mouth and let out a short, sharp whistle. It wasn't a loud, piercing shriek. It was a high, staccato chirp, a sound that didn't exist in the aggressive, guttural vocabulary of German and Dutch commands these trainers used. It was an anomaly, a pattern interrupt. Bruno's ears immediately popped up, swiveling forward like radar dishes. The whale eye disappeared, replaced by sharp-focused amber irises. He tilted his head. The moment he looked at her, Casey didn't pull him toward her. Instead, she took a deliberate step backward. She stepped aside, opening up the space between them, giving him a physical avenue of escape. She dropped her shoulder, turning her body at an angle so she wasn't facing him square on. It was a submissive posture, an invitation rather than a demand. Bruno stood up. The trembling had stopped. Casey took another step back, dragging the leash lightly across the ground. She patted her left thigh twice, a soft slapping sound against her cargo pants. Bruno hesitated. He looked back at Jenkins, then at the decoy, then finally at the quiet woman offering him a pocket of low-pressure air. Slowly, cautiously, he took a step forward. Casey stepped back again, moving fluidly, leading him without touching him. "Come on, buddy," she murmured, her tone barely above a whisper, casual and indifferent. Bruno took 3 more steps, closing the distance. He walked up to her left leg and stopped. He didn't cower. He stood tall, his nose brushing against the fabric of her pants, catching the scent of gunpowder, old sweat, and stale coffee. Casey didn't reach down to pet him. She didn't praise him with an overly excited squeal. She just stood there, letting him exist in her space without demanding rent for it. "Decoy," Casey said, keeping her voice low and even. "Walk across the yard, don't charge. Just walk laterally." The padded man by the fence nodded, stepping out and walking across the asphalt. Bruno's body immediately tensed. His hackles, the strip of fur along his spine, raised up. A low rumble started in his chest. But because Casey wasn't pulling back on the leash, because she wasn't tightening the noose and confirming his panic. His brain was forced to process the information differently. He wasn't trapped. Therefore, the man walking was no longer a nightmare. He was just a target. Casey felt the dog lean forward, shifting his weight onto his front paws. She felt the sudden, raw kinetic energy spooling up in his muscles. She didn't tighten the leash. She just leaned forward with him. "Bite," she whispered. She dropped the leash entirely. Bruno exploded. Without the heavy restraint dragging him backward, he launched off the asphalt like a fired missile. He covered the 20 yards in 3 seconds, a blur of tan and black muscle. The decoy barely had time to turn and present the padded sleeve before 90 pounds of German Shepherd slammed into him. The impact cracked like a baseball bat. Bruno drove his jaws deep into the thick canvas, locking his back molars, thrashing his head with a violent, primal intensity. He drove the decoy backward, putting the man on his heels, dominating the fight completely. Casey stood calmly, her hands in her pockets, watching the dog tear into the sleeve. She turned her head slightly to look at O'Connor and Jenkins. Both men were staring at the spectacle, mouths slightly open, the arrogance completely drained from their faces. "He doesn't have weak nerves," Casey said, her voice dry as the desert dirt. "He just didn't trust you enough to fight your battles while you were choking him." She turned back to watch the dog, her throbbing knee momentarily forgotten. The dog didn't need a heavy hand. He just needed someone to stop yelling, open the door, and get the hell out of his way. Bureaucracy always smelled like ozone from a dying copy machine and severely bruised egos. O'Connor's office was a cramped shoebox tucked into the back of the kennel block, aggressively air-conditioned to combat the Nevada inferno just beyond the thin drywall. The sudden temperature drop made the dull ache in Casey's knee sharpen into a biting ice-pick throb. She stood leaning her good hip against the cheap veneer of his desk, stubbornly refusing the plastic folding chair he hadn't actually offered. O'Connor was aggressively typing on a reinforced laptop, deliberately taking his time before looking up. When he finally did, his pale blue eyes were hard, calculating and laced with distinct resentment. A female chief walking onto his blacktop and showing up his lead handler in front of the whole yard wasn't going to sit well. In the teams, ego was supposed to take a back seat to results. But out here in the training command, guys clung to their methods like religious doctrine. "You got lucky, Chief," O'Connor finally said, leaning back. The chair groaned under his weight. "You interrupted a behavioral loop. You confused the dog. That bite was a prey-drive reflex, not tactical aggression. He'll still wash on a live op." Casey pulled a folded piece of paper from her cargo pocket and dropped it flat on the keyboard, covering O'Connor's hands. "Transfer form," she said, her voice flat, scraping against the hum of the AC unit. "I'm taking him." O'Connor looked at the form, then up at her. A bitter laugh barked out of his chest. "You're a door kicker on medical hold. You don't have a handler's cert. You don't have an authorization code. And frankly, you can barely walk." "The base commander signed it 20 minutes ago," Casey replied, not blinking. "I told him I needed a pet to help with my physical therapy. He thought it was a great PR move for the Wounded Warrior Initiative. Signed it without reading the dog's serial number. It was a lie, partially. She had pulled every favor, called in every chit she had banked over 12 years of deployments, and essentially bullied a junior lieutenant into stamping the paperwork while the commander was at lunch. But the ink was wet, and the stamp was official. O'Connor's jaw flexed. He stared at the paper, reading the wet blue ink that stripped Bruno from his inventory. "You're making a mistake. The animal is defective. When he snaps under real pressure, He's going to take a chunk out of one of your guys. Or you. I'll take my chances, Casey said, pulling her hand back. She turned toward the door, her boots scuffing the linoleum. I need his shot records and his gear bag left by Run 42. And tell Jenkins to stop using the prong collar. He doesn't know how to time the correction. He's just choking them for fun. She didn't wait for a response. She pushed through the heavy metal door and stepped out into the kennel corridor. The noise hit her like a physical blow. 100 concrete runs, chain-link fences, and 70 dogs screaming at the top of their lungs. The acoustic bounce of concrete and metal turned the barking into a wall of sharp, concussive pressure. It smelled violently of industrial bleach, wet fur, and raw meat. Casey limped down the narrow center aisle. Dogs hurled themselves against the chain link as she passed, snapping and spinning in chaotic frenzy. These were high-drive Malinois and Shepherds, bred for war, going stir-crazy in their concrete boxes. She stopped at Run 42. Bruno wasn't at the gate. He was curled in the furthest, darkest corner of his concrete cell. Pressed so hard against the cinder block wall, he looked like he was trying to merge with it. His amber eyes tracked her, reflecting the harsh fluorescent overhead lights. He didn't bark. He just watched, his body coiled tight, waiting for the punishment. Casey unlatched the gate. The metal latch clacked loudly, making the shepherd flinch. She stepped inside, locking it behind her. She didn't speak. She didn't offer a hand for him to sniff. She sat down on the damp, cold concrete, stretching her bad leg out in front of her, with a quiet hiss of pain. She pulled a Ziploc bag from her pocket. Inside were pieces of dehydrated beef liver. She tossed one piece halfway across the floor. It landed with a soft tink on the concrete. Bruno stared at the liver, then at her. He didn't move. "Suit yourself," Casey muttered, leaning her head back against the chain link. She sat there for 45 minutes. The concrete leached the heat from her bones, and her back stiffened, but she forced herself to remain entirely still. She closed her eyes, listening to the chaotic symphony of the kennels. Eventually, she heard the soft, hesitant scrape of claws on concrete. Then, the wet sound of a nose sniffing. A wet sponge touched the back of her hand, right on the knuckle. Casey opened her eyes. Bruno was standing beside her, chewing the piece of liver. Up close, away from the dust of the yard, she could see the heavy scarring on his snout. A map of corrections from previous handlers who thought pain equaled respect. He smelled like anxiety and stale kibble. She didn't reach up to pet him. She just tossed another piece of liver onto her thigh. Bruno took it, his teeth gently scraping her pants. He was clumsy, unsure of how to take something without being yelled at. "We're going to my quarters," Casey said, her voice a low vibration in her chest. "It's small. It smells like icy hot and old coffee. You're going to hate it." She clipped a flat nylon collar around his neck, pointedly leaving the heavy chain choke collar hanging on the fence. When she stood, her knee locked, and she stumbled slightly. Bruno didn't bolt. He stepped sideways, bracing his heavy shoulder against her good leg, offering a solid point of gravity until she caught her balance. He didn't look at her for approval. He just stared straight ahead at the gate, waiting for the lock to open. Casey looked down at the dog. She didn't want a dog. She wanted her team back. She wanted her knee to bend without feeling like shattered glass. She was tired, cynical, and utterly burnt out on fixing broken things. "All right," she breathed, opening the latch. "Let's get out of here." Sleep remained an elusive, hostile territory. It wasn't a place of rest. It was a combat zone where the ambush always came at 0300. The digital clock on the bedside table burned a harsh red. 3:14 a.m. Casey lay flat on her back, staring at the ceiling of her base apartment. The oscillating fan clicked rhythmically at the end of its rotation. Whir, click, whir, click. It was a miserable, humid night. The sheets clung to her legs, damp with a cold, sour sweat that smelled distinctly of adrenaline. Her heart was hammering a jagged rhythm against her ribs, the residual echo of a nightmare she couldn't quite remember, but one that left the metallic taste of copper in her mouth. She threw the thin blanket off and sat up, rubbing the heels of her hands into her eye sockets, until sparks danced in the darkness. A low, deep vibration cut through the silence. Casey dropped her hands. Across the room, in the narrow gap between the cheap dresser and the closet door, a black mass was trembling. Bruno was awake. He was laying on his side, his legs twitching violently, claws lightly scratching at the cheap linoleum floor. A muffled, high-pitched whine was forcing its way out of his closed jaws. He wasn't dreaming of chasing rabbits. His breathing was rapid, shallow, bordering on hyperventilation. The dog was having a night terror. Casey stood, the cold floor sending a shock up her bad leg. She crossed the room silently, dropping to her knees a few feet away from the dog. Most people would reach out to shake a dog awake, to soothe it. Casey knew better. Waking a combat-wired brain in the middle of a panic loop was a good way to get your face torn off. Instead, she sat down cross-legged, establishing a heavy physical presence without crossing his invisible perimeter. "Hey," she said. It was just a gravelly whisper. Bruno's eyes snapped open. In the dim light from the street lamp filtering through the blinds, his amber eyes were blown wide, pupils dilated to black pools of pure terror. He scrambled backward, his claws seeking traction on the slick floor, slamming his spine into the dresser. He bared his teeth, a low, guttural snarl vibrating in his throat. He didn't know where he was. He was back in whatever mental cage the trainers had built for him. Casey didn't flinch. She didn't retreat, and she didn't move forward. She just picked up a discarded t-shirt from the floor and tossed it lightly onto his front paws. The fabric smelled aggressively of her, sweat, gun oil, and the mint soap she used. Bruno snapped at the shirt, but the moment the scent hit his olfactory glands, the snarl broke. He froze. The wild, hunted look in his eyes slowly receded, replaced by exhausted confusion. He looked at the shirt, then up at the quiet woman sitting on the floor in the dark. He let out a heavy sigh, his lungs completely deflating, and rested his heavy chin on her shirt. "Yeah, I know," Casey whispered into the dark. "The quiet is worse than the noise." She didn't try to pet him. She just sat with him on the cold linoleum until the clock on the nightstand read 4 a.m., matching her erratic breathing to his slow, steady pants, anchoring them both in the miserable present. 2 weeks later, the friction between them shifted from personal to tactical. They were in the plywood kill house on the edge of the range. It was a mock-up of an Afghan compound, smelling of fresh sawdust, spent brass, and kicked-up desert dust. Casey was geared up. Plate carrier, helmet, night vision mounts, and her suppressed MK-18 rifle slung tight to her chest. Behind her stood Dawson and Hutchins, two operators from Charlie Platoon who owed her money and agreed to run dry drills on their day off. At Casey's left thigh, Bruno sat in a rigid, perfect heel. There was no leather leash. There was no prong collar. Casey wore a thick rigger's belt, and clipped to it was a bungee retention lanyard attached to Bruno's tactical harness. It gave him exactly 3 feet of slack. "All right," Dawson muttered from behind her, checking the bolt on his rifle. "We're stacking on the primary door. We breach, we clear left, dog goes right. You sure he's not going to fracture when the flashbang pops? If he fractures, Casey said, her thumb hovering over her rifle's safety selector. But he won't. She looked down at the dog. Bruno wasn't looking around. He wasn't panting. His eyes were locked dead on the plywood door, his ears pinned straight forward. The nervous, shivering wreck from the training yard was gone. In his place was 90 pounds of coiled kinetic violence waiting for the release valve. Casey shifted her weight to her good leg. She didn't say a word. She just dropped her left hand from the handguard of her rifle and gave her thigh 2 quick, silent taps. Bruno leaned forward, taking up the slack in the bungee, feeling the physical tension between his harness and her belt. Hutchins moved up, planting a dummy charge on the door handle. He stepped back. Breaching, breaching, breaching! He kicked the door. The heavy wood slammed inward with a deafening crack, instantly followed by the simulated boom of a training flashbang. Smoke and dust filled the entryway. Dawson pushed in, cutting hard left. Casey moved right, stepping into the fatal funnel of the doorway. She didn't yell a command. She didn't tell Bruno to clear. She unclipped the carabiner from her belt, letting the lanyard drop. Bruno shot into the dark room like a ghost. He didn't bark. He was entirely silent, sweeping the right corner in a low, predatory crouch. A cardboard silhouette target stood in the corner. Bruno hit it full force, taking it to the ground with a savage tear of cardboard dominating the space before Casey even had her muzzle raised. "Clear left," Dawson called out over the ringing in their ears. "Clear right," Casey responded, stepping over the threshold. She looked down. Bruno was standing over the shredded target. He looked up at her, waiting. There was no fear in his eyes. There was only focus. He had finally figured out that she wasn't the threat holding him back. She was the anchor letting him fly. Rain fell in heavy, punishing sheets, turning the dirt of the San Clemente Island training facility into thick, sucking mud. It was 0 dark 30, and the temperature had plummeted, stripping the heat from the California coast and replacing it with a biting wet chill that seeped into the marrow. Casey knelt in the sludge, the freezing water quickly soaking through the reinforced knees of her tactical pants. The familiar jagged ache flared in her joint, a sharp reminder of the shrapnel that had nearly ended her career. She swallowed the pain, forcing it down into a dark metal box, and adjusted the heavy, dual-tube night vision goggles flipped down over her eyes. Through the phosphor-green glow, the world was cast in eerie, sharp relief. 100 yards ahead loomed the objective, a multi-story concrete structure designed to mimic a high-value target compound. Tonight was the final validation. Live rounds. Live Op 4. Opposing forces played by other operators using simulation rounds that left massive purple bruises. And watching from the metal catwalks above the kill house was the entire training cadre, including O'Connor. This was the hurdle. If Casey's knee held up, she was cleared for active duty. If Bruno held his nerve, he earned his trident patch. If either of them slipped, they were permanently riding a desk. Beside her, Bruno was a statue carved from shadow. The rain slicked his thick fur flat against his heavy musculature. But he didn't shiver. He didn't pace. He sat in a perfect rigid heel against Casey's hip. His breathing was a slow, controlled furnace. "1 minute," Dawson murmured over the encrypted comms, his voice a distorted crackle in Casey's earpiece. Casey didn't answer verbally. She reached down, her gloved fingers tracing the damp nylon of Bruno's tactical harness. She felt the heavy, rhythmic thud of his heart. It was slow, steady. The frantic, hyperventilating animal from the Nevada blacktop had been completely rewritten. She had spent the last 3 months proving to him that he didn't need to fear the leash, and in return, he had given her absolute terrifying loyalty. "Move," Dawson ordered. They rose as one fluid entity. The squad bounded forward, boots squelching in the mud, rifles raised. Casey kept her pace deliberate, favoring her good leg just slightly, but eating up the ground with a quiet, lethal efficiency. Bruno moved with her, checking his stride to match hers. A silent phantom tethered only by mutual understanding. They hit the exterior wall. Dawson planted the breaching charge on the heavy steel door. Casey stepped back, pulling Bruno against her leg. She didn't cover his ears. She didn't command him to brace. The charge detonated with a concussive shock wave that punched the air out of their lungs. Dirt and concrete dust rained down, mixing with the downpour. The door blew inward. "Push!" They flooded the entryway. Suppressed rifles coughed. Thwip, 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 as Dawson and Hutchins took down 2 cardboard targets in the foyer. The smell of cordite and burnt magnesium instantly overpowered the scent of the rain. They cleared the first floor in 90 seconds. Brutal, clinical violence. Through it all, Bruno remained glued to Casey's side, ignoring the gunfire, ignoring the shouting Op 4 targets, waiting for the green light. They reached the stairwell leading to the basement. It was a known choke point. "Stack up," Dawson whispered, pressing his back against the concrete wall. Casey moved to the front. She tapped her thigh. Bruno stepped up, nosing past her legs to peer into the pitch-black descent. Suddenly the dog froze. He didn't crouch to clear. He didn't lean into his harness. He planted his front paws firmly on the top step, his hackles raising into a stiff ridge along his spine. He let out a vibration, not quite a growl, just a deep, tectonic rumble in his chest that Casey could feel through the floorboards. "What is it?" Hutchins muttered from the rear. "Send him." On the catwalk above, Casey knew O'Connor was watching through infrared cameras, waiting for the dog to fracture, waiting for the hesitation that proved he was a washout. "No," Casey whispered. She trusted the dog's nose more than the architectural blueprints. Bruno wasn't scared. He was alerting. Casey reached out and pulled Dawson back by the shoulder plate, physically hauling him away from the stairwell opening. She stepped back, giving Bruno space. "He's signaling a trap," Casey said softly. "The brief said the basement was clear," Dawson argued, adrenaline making his voice tight. "The brief is wrong." Casey looked at the dog. Bruno was staring intensely at the solid drywall adjacent to the stairs, ignoring the open stairwell entirely. She raised her MK-18, leveling the muzzle at the blank wall. Wall bang, 3 rounds. She squeezed the trigger. The suppressed rifle chattered. The 5.56 rounds punched clean through the cheap drywall. Immediately, a muffled shout of pain echoed from behind the wall, followed by the clatter of a dropped weapon. An Op 4 role player had been hiding in a concealed crawl space designed to shoot them in the back the moment they committed to the stairs. It was an unscripted ambush meant to fail the squad. The hidden panel kicked open. The Op 4 actor stumbled out, clutching a bruised shoulder where a sim round had tagged his vest, his face pale beneath his night vision gear. He raised his hands. Casey didn't lower her weapon. She looked down at Bruno. The dog was looking up at her. He didn't need a heavy leather strap. He didn't need to be choked into submission. He just needed someone to listen when he spoke. "Good boy," she whispered, her voice rough. An hour later, the squad stood under the harsh halogen floodlights of the debriefing tent. The rain hammered against the canvas roof. They were soaked, shivering, and covered in mud. O'Connor walked in. He held a clipboard, his face a stony mask. He looked at Dawson, then at Hutchins, and finally at Casey. Bruno was sitting on Casey's boots, leaning his heavy wet head against her bad knee, providing a gentle, solid warmth against the throbbing joint. O'Connor stared at the dog for a long time. The oppressive silence stretched, heavy with the weight of unsaid apologies and fractured egos. He slowly uncapped a pen, flipped to the back page of the dossier, and scrawled a heavy, deliberate signature. He ripped the page off and handed it to Casey. It was a Tier 1 K-9 certification. "He's yours, Chief," O'Connor said quietly. He didn't smile, but the resentment was gone, replaced by a quiet, begrudging respect. "Don't break him." Casey took the paper, folding it carefully into her damp pocket. She looked down at the dog who had failed every test until the test stopped mattering. "I won't," she said. "He's the one holding me together. True loyalty isn't forged by a heavy hand or a choke collar. It's built in the quiet spaces where we give others the grace to figure it out." Casey and Bruno proved that sometimes the most broken parts of us are exactly what make us lethal. If this story hit home for you, drop a like, hit that subscribe button, and share it with someone who knows what it means to fight for a second chance. See you next time.